Thanks everybody for sticking around. We are here for the last session of today. Definitely not the least. One of the ones that I'm most excited for. Very, very happy and privileged to be able to introduce Hugo Philion, who is an incredible founder, has become a dear friend, and is the founder of Flare.xyz, which is an incredible project that is adding utility to chains which have less utility. He's going to tell you a lot more about it. I have to say that he's come out in the past, 4, maybe 2 months as a really strong supporter of Handshake. And it's really interesting to see people from different chains and different protocols who are finding ways, very interesting ways to kind of use the Handshake ecosystem and the Handshake blockchain for ways that...
Thanks, Jehan. Let me see if I can share my screen. That might help. Let me play this. Hopefully everyone can see that. I can't see you guys now. I can only see this presentation. So what I want to discuss today, if that's possible, to try and break down quickly, is why we're building Flare, and how Flare might add some additional utility really to the Handshake ecosystem through potentially the creation and distribution of SLDs on Flare, but also the tokenization of TLDs and of course SLDs as sort of, I guess, NFTs, and then also additionally, why Flare might be an interesting option in order to, I guess, increase the community that Handshake has, available to it. So I'm just going to jump out of this presentation for a second, just to make sure that I'm not getting any messages that say you can't see anything or anything like that. Okay, cool. Great. So yeah, let's just... let me just jump back to that then. No, that's the wrong one. Okay, so, okay, there we are. Great, so, without further ado, sorry about that. One of the things we think about a lot, and really sort of the reason why Flare exists is that, in our industry, a lot of people talk about adoption and getting mainstream adoption and all that kind of stuff. But decentralization is quite a tough topic for people to understand, and it's something that's, I feel, we've got this group of people, users and value, that exist already in our space, but are massively underutilized. Because if we think that many of the sort of leading applications now are smart contract based, really, you've then got this huge kind of tail end of things, which is not accessible really to smart contracts in a decentralized way, or a trustless way. I appreciate that there are bridges that have been built to different networks. However, we've done a lot of analysis on those kind of bridges, and most of them have an element of a custodial or a centralized nature. So really, we look at this ecosystem, Bitcoin, XRP, Litecoin, Bitcoin Cash, Stellar, Doge, even Cardano, which today doesn't have smart contracts or even potentially Algorand. And to us, that's a huge amount of people and a huge amount of value that really can be brought into an ecosystem and then hopefully used for the greater good. And really, that's the place, if we want mainstream adoption, that we feel we should start. So, as a brief intro to what Flare is trying to achieve, it's built to bring scalable, trustless, smart contract utility to tokens and networks that don't have it. That's kind of our strapline, is actually unlocking value. Maximalism. We see a token and its value as just being like a currency, and we see the user base as people and not people that we want to necessarily push away because they don't share exactly the same ideas as everyone else with regards to decentralization and that kind of stuff. So that's really what we're building it for. And so Flare is really being built to allow these networks to access smart contracts And the really cool thing, which I'll hopefully touch on at the end, is that the way Flare is structured is a federated Byzantine agreement network. It's the first kind of FBA that has capable of being Turing complete, so it integrates the Ethereum virtual machine, and it allows each underlying network, so let's say Handshake, let's say Bitcoin, let's say Stellar, to participate in the consensus. And that's a complex idea, but I'll try and break out security testing. We're going to go open source in April, and then we're launching in June, July. So one of the things that Flare is trying to do is we have something called the FAsset Protocol, and that's an economic trustless bridge from each of these networks that Flare will attach to. So at the moment, it's XLM, XRP, Doge, and Litecoin, and potentially many others, and of course Handshake. But the economic bridge for Handshake's a little different. We don't have one, and we're not planning on building one yet. There's a different thing that we're building for that, and I'll come on to that in a second. But the idea really behind Flare at its sort of core is to bring the value from these networks onto a smart contract platform so that they can be cross-composable, so that we can aggregate the liquidity, because a lot of the solutions I see at the moment that are being put forward as interoperability solutions, actually they fracture liquidity across zones or subnets or whatever they call them. They fracture that liquidity, and to me, actually, the big breakthrough in smart contracts has been the idea of composability, the idea that I can have some protocol and then someone else can come and build on above that protocol, and then someone else, and it can all be composed into, I think, the best way to call it is money Lego. And so we feel that this liquidity aggregation, getting all this value, trying to get it into one place rather than fractured across lots of subchains or zones, really should breed engagement and participation. And at the heart of Flare is a kind of DeFi protocol, because the bridge is economic. And so here's what's really relevant to Handshake. Because Handshake today isn't suitable to be part of the economic bridge because it requires a high volume, token like HNS. But Flare has this really robust and free to use kind of Oracle system whereby each node on Flare is coming to consensus and contributing to consensus over the state of another network, actually at the consensus level of Flare. So it's free to use. And essentially, Flare can basically observe Handshake or any other blockchain, and see what the state is, as it goes through time. And so that's a very useful tool because it then allows, smart contracts to be built and other things to happen that allow for greater utility. And we are, with regards to get their tokens represented on Flare as in a trustless manner. But we can use that for anything that has state. So we can use that for top level domains, and that's kind of where we're going with this. So we have kind of we've just started working really with a few people in the Handshake ecosystem, so Chango and Tishan. And I think that's kind of expanding out into, I guess, a working group that's looking at how to get, tokenized TLDs, SLDs of those TLDs, and then tokenizing those SLDs on Flare. And we got a couple of kind of models, and this is not meant to be prescriptive. We have no fixed thoughts on it, but I'll just take you through like kind of roughly what we think the models look like today, and it could change massively. So, our idea would be that you could lock a TLD on Handshake using something like an HTLC sort of system, and then that would allow for an HTLC basically can either be locked in perpetuity or for some time period, and we call this like a leasing or a total locking mechanism. So, if it's totally locked, then you can't really come back on that HTLC, and it can't be unlocked at a later date. And for us, that gets the TLD onto Flare in perpetuity, but that may not be the only desirable way to do it. So there's kind of like a leasing model whereby the TLD can exist on Flare for a certain period of time. And then that TLD can be, the TLD representation can be locked in a smart contract on Flare that then enables the minting of myriad SLDs, which either are in perpetuity based on the TLDs in perpetuity, or essentially leased like the traditional SLD model for some period of time, essentially for the period of time that the HTLC locks the TLD for. And so the upside of this particular kind of idea is it's quite simple. The downside really is that the TLD is either locked in perpetuity, which may give a lack of flexibility to the owner, because they may Flare might become less interested, not locked in perpetuity. Then there's a non-renewal risk for the SLD owner. And so they may lease a particular SLD for a period of time. They may become successful with that, and then they may not be able to renew it because the owner takes that away. So we think there's another model as well, which uses collateral, which kind of aligns people's interests such that, if an SLD is incredibly valuable, that there isn't a renewal risk, because it's definitely in the TLD owner's interest to renew the lease. And so we think you could have a collateralized smart contract where the TLD owner essentially loses the collateral when the name server is changed, erroneously. And that would be essentially if the smart contract says it's there for a year, and after 6 months the records are changed. And so the positive of this would be there'd be sort of more security for the SLD owner, we think, versus a temporary leasing model, because as I just said, if it's a valuable proposition, then the TLD owner will obviously carry on doing it. And then more flexibility for the TLD owner versus, say, locking TLD onto any particular network in perpetuity. And so the negative of this is that it requires meaningful collateral, but that's where DeFi comes in. And there's, this gives the opportunity for someone else to provide that collateral, and there to be a sharing of revenue against, let's say, the leasing of SLDs, or the tokenization of SLDs. And so, that's a TLD SLD kind of ideas that we have, and it's nothing to do with us. We aren't building it, but that's where we've got into with the kind of working group, and we'd like to sort of continue thinking about various different ideas. Now, I mean, our envisaged uses for SLDs are, something we've been thinking about for 2 months. Give us a year, it could be, so much more. But really, it opens up the SLD and, in fact, the TLD market, the tokenized TLD market, to all of Flare's integrated tokens. So, Dogecoin, Litecoin, Stellar, XRP, obviously at some point, probably Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin, I assume those will be integrated, and their user bases. And those user bases are vast. And some of them, especially XRP, for instance, are extremely motivated to get engaged with things because they've been held back from being engaged for 3 or 4 years. So that's a real, I think, value proposition. The second thing is, of course, DeFi on, borrowing against your own property, whether it's a TLD or an SLD. You can lock that in a contract, and someone might lend you money against that. Essentially, is a collateralized debt, and that to us is a really interesting proposition. And I'm sure there's a billion things that could be built on that. The last is as a kind of tokenized version of any object on the planet. Whether it's actual physical space, like a 3x3 foot representation, or whether it's, as I've put here in this example, a barrel of oil that is sweet crude from Aramco, or a barrel of oil that is sour crude from Petrobras. These are just physical objects, but they can be, identifiers to anything that could be tokenized and traded in the real world. So for me, that would be a really interesting kind of way to adapt the SLD concept to be a sort of more generic registry and naming device. So, that's just some ideas we have. The last thing I really wanted to cover was the participation in the Flare consensus. So every network that is attached to via the state connector, which is our kind of oracle that happens at the consensus level. Flare, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a federated Byzantine agreement style network. And we set that up as a deterministic UNL. So there's no foundation deciding who is the node, who are the nodes, and there isn't the fragility of total unmitigated FBA, which has a real issue with fragility and finding the quorum intersection property. So it's a deterministic UNL, but essentially, and we're lucky because we have all these kind of partner networks, we might call it, that maybe derive some additional utility by coming to Flare. And so we can essentially assign the calculation based on, I don't know, market cap, we think is the right way to do it today. But we can assign a certain amount of power in the UNL. And then the validators from each underlying chain, they then have the right to run a Flare validator. And they get that, and then they get a mining incentive for doing that. But they're also contributing to something, as a larger community. And that's very important. And so, just very briefly, the power in the UNL goes to each underlying network, miners and validators, as capped at 25% per network or per merge mined network. So Dogecoin and LTC would be capped together. So if Handshake is integrated with the state connector, Handshake miners may run Flare nodes and be part of the UNL. What are we doing specifically in the Handshake ecosystem? Well, right now, as I said, we're working on bringing SLDs and TLDs as tokenized assets to Flare. And secondly, we're working with some of our custodians to get the HNS asset onto Flare. We can't do it trustlessly yet because it's not liquid enough, but we're working to get a wrapped custodial version onto Flare so that it can be traded on automated market makers with the aim of increasing the liquidity of the token, which should bring tangible benefits to the community. And so, in summary, Flare's purpose-built to serve a network like Handshake, which has a very defined purpose, but could acquire more utility through Flare. I think it's really important to stress that we really see these communities actually as the basis of what we're doing, but also the basis of the future of the entire industry. And we're interested in bringing communities together to build something bigger than the sum of the parts, because frankly, that's how we feel that this whole decentralization idea goes mainstream. And so there's, as I hope I took you through, there's multiple models for top-level domain representation and SLD creation. They have different trade-offs, but they create very exciting use cases. We're already working with parts of the Handshake ecosystem, and if you integrate with Flare, you'll have a role in the Flare consensus. Please reach out to Chango, Tishan, Jehan Chu, or myself, really to get involved or ask more questions. I would say probably at this stage. So let me just stop sharing.
There's a question in the chat. It was mentioned in a previous session from phase one that SLDs sold to traditional registries would no longer be decentralized, which is true in Handshake natively. So essentially, with Flare, you can maintain decentralization of the SLDs and not just the TLDs. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would think so. Fairly accurate assessment, and I mean, you really want that because once you have the SLD, and then let's say you do turn it into just a tokenized asset. So, for instance, the oil barrel sort of example I said. By the way, I think this is wonderful for mineral traceability, which is actually a really important thing. Once you've got that as an asset, it's very important that it is decentralized.
Great, thanks. How did you get into Handshake anyway? I mean, what's your kind of?
So I read about it a while back. but I hadn't seen that much about it for a period of time, and then we discussed it. And really, one of the things we started thinking about was, okay, so we have to organize a whole bunch of validators. And a registry is an interesting idea for us. We haven't figured out where that registry should be based yet. Ultimately, there needs to be some kind of access token for validators that are part of the UNL for a specific period. And we're looking at different methods, and Handshake seems like a very interesting method for doing that.
Can you see, I mean, the idea for, I mean, when you first brought it up, the idea of using Handshake as like a reference layer or a registry layer for other systems was pretty like revolutionary for me. I never really thought about it because, as I said in my opening, I feel like I always think of Handshake as like an identity layer for like persons, places, things, and ephemera. And, I love the idea of being able to tokenize objects, right? Because for me, the whole digital twinning is like, especially in NFTs, is a foregone conclusion. And the idea that you can have a namespace which actually names the NFT, down to its location, perhaps, is super interesting. But the idea that you could actually, have identity for systems or system-level identity, which is secured by other systems like Handshake, is pretty interesting. Can you kind of tell me a little bit more about how you see this playing out, or what other applications of Handshake as a registry layer for things other than the actual domain?
Yeah, I really want to have Handshake as a registry layer for physical space. I think, to me, that's one of the sort of holy grails, is to take our physical world and have like real, and I guess, you'd have to have some kind of soft human consensus that this is a way to do it. We've seen some early centralized examples of creating kind of human readable registries, such as, there's a great example, what 3 words. But I like the idea that should not be controlled by a particular company, and it should be something that is a shared community asset. This idea of physical space, it's because it's a public good, and so I like that.
Got it. Thanks. I don't know if there are any more questions from the crowd. There's one. Lou had another one. So to maintain decentralization on SLDs would mean that it becomes essential for Handshake name resolution to be integrated into browsers and routers. Otherwise, mainstream adoption may be stunted. So does the decentralization of SLDs rely on the adoption through browsers and routers?
Yeah, if the only thing you're trying to do is to achieve the ability to reference things in that way, I guess what I'm saying is for physical assets, or even for the Flare Flare using Handshake as a registry for its network structure, that doesn't need the adoption of browsers and routers. That needs the adoption of whoever's using it, and the first example of that might be Flare as a system. So that's an example.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, again, for some reason, I always just think about Handshake as like this kind of meta naming layer for a lot of different chains and a lot of different kind of applications and a lot of different types of digital material, digitally referenceable kind of materials, and that's where I think this starts to kind of get super super interesting. Cool. And
I suppose we see Handshake as a kind of decentralized certificate authority. Would be our kind of idea of it.
What do you think about the tradability? What do you think, like, the ability to have wrapped domain names, whether TLD or SLD, what becomes possible in Flare in terms of like the kind of trading side? You mentioned like collateral, being able to get loans on your domains and being able to kind of collateralize. What else do you think kind of makes, what other applications will be on Flare, and how will they get on Flare such that we could use
machines? So it's pretty easy for people to build on it. So I think it's largely going to be about us as a community promulgating the ideas about like, okay, so this is what could be done. Is this interesting? But with regards to trading, I mean, I'd almost start with just a borrowing idea. Imagine you have a really hot TLD, something, awesome that, is acquiring loads and loads of SLDs, right? Because it's got a great, traction. Let's say it's .nft, right? And let's say, you want to monetize your .nft domain. Now, if you sell it, you may have, you may not want to sell it. You may think there's more upside, but you may wish to acquire a little bit of liquidity from it. So, one of the first things you could do with a tokenized TLD that sits on a smart contract layer is, just borrow against it, lock it, see what people will lend against it for what kind of period of time. They can take the token if you don't pay it back, and ultimately, that would be the way we would administer that, and then they would inherit the SLDs ultimately. So, that would be an example.
There's really interesting models of kind of like liquid bidding. I'm just making up words here, but in the NFT community, where you can kind of bid on things that don't have a bid. So somehow, I think it was like somehow using like automated market maker systems to actually project bids at NFTs which don't have, which aren't necessarily for sale. And I kind of like that idea. I think it might also be kind of a feature that's being looked at ShakeDex and others. But I can see how all these kind of different systems can be utilized on Flare. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think we'd love that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we'd love that.
Cool. I think we're just about out of time, and really happy to have you kind of with us and able to kind of tell us all about Flare. And I think hopefully, we'll see everything coming out. When is it going to be coming out again? When is Flare launching? Testnet?
We're really pushing. Oh, Testnet is, so Testnet's already been up, but public open Testnet is sort of middle of April. And we're doing a few sort of private and then public betas. And then we're really pushing to try and get it out by the end of June.
Great. All right. Well, looking forward. I think we're going to wrap it up there. Thanks again, Hugo, and really appreciate it. And we'll do a quick wrap up of this. Thanks.
My pleasure.